So in the last video, we finished uploading our image for the house to Cloudinary. And now in this one, we're going to work on creating the mutation to create the house in our database. So to do that, we're going to start in the schema folder, src schema, inside of the house. And we're just going to import everything from now. I don't know if we'll use everything yet, but at least we'll have everything available to us. So when you call a mutation, there's sort of two parts to it. There's what input is it going to receive? It's like when you're calling a function and you pass in arguments or parameters. So those are the input fields. And then you think about what does it return back? That's the response type. So we're going to start by declaring the input fields for this mutation. And the first thing we need is that we're sending the coordinates of the house, the latitude and the longitude. So we're actually going to package those together in something called a coordinates input. So coordinates input. Input, boom. Okay, so this has two fields. It has the latitude, which is a number, and it has the longitude, which is a number. But we need to declare all of the type stuff. And even before that, why don't we go up here and we need to wrap around here that this is an input that we're declaring. I don't think you need that semicolon. And this is a field. Field. Okay, so what does the type of this field? It's a float coming from type GraphQL. So we'll do the same thing down here. This is a float as well. And you'd be fine with this, but we can actually add a little bit of validation to this input. So we're going to say that this is a min of minus 90 and a max of 90. Like this. And we can declare the same for longitude, but it is 180. So minus 180 on the min and plus 180 on the max. So this is the declaration for our coordinates. So now what about the rest of the house information? We'll call this the house input. So class house input. This is an input type like that. And we need to declare the fields. So we're going to say it's an address, which is a string. I'm just going to declare the fields first, and then I'll add all the decorators to them. So we have an image, which is also a string. It's going to be that secure URL that we got back last time. We have coordinates, which is actually this here. So that's what it's going to return. And then we have bedrooms, which is a number. So those are the fields we want. We need to decorate them. So we'll say field, its type that it's returning is a string. Copy and pasting for image, because that's also for coordinates. We want to return a coordinates input. So you can just double that up. Sort of TypeScript, GraphQL type, TypeScript type here. And we'll do bedrooms, which is type is an int, like this. So here's our house input, which receives our coordinates input. Those are the inputs for our mutation. What is our mutation going to give us as a response? For that, you create an object type. So we say class house, and we'll decorate it. Keep getting, there we go. So we'll decorate it with object type so that it knows what it is. And now we just have to declare a whole bunch of properties. So it's not very complicated. It's just sort of tedious to type them all out. So we have an ID as a number. We have a user ID as a string. So we know who owns it. Oops. We have a latitude, which is a number. Longitude, which is a number. Address, which is a string, image, which is a string, and bedrooms, which is a number. So those are our fields for now. We're going to add one extra, but we'll get to that in a second. We're just going to decorate these first. So this one in TypeScript terms will be an ID. I'm just going to copy and paste. This one's a string. This one is a float. This one's also a float. Address would be a string. Image would be a string. and bedrooms would be an int. Cool. So this is typed now, but we're going to add one additional field, and I'm just going to put it below the image. Image is that full URL, that secure URL, but I want to be able to just access the public ID part because that's what's needed to display the image using Cloudinary image component. It just wants the public ID, it doesn't want the rest. It will figure that out itself. So we're going to say that this is going to be a field of type string. That's what it will return. And we'll call this public ID. But this isn't just a property, this is actually going to be a function that will return a string. So what we can actually do is access, why don't we access it first? So this .image, we're basically accessing this property. We're going to split it by sort of portions of the path. And then we're going to get the parts for this. Like that. So now what we're going to do is we basically want to access the last part of that. So that's the public ID .jpeg or whatever. That's what we want, the extension as well. So to access the last of an array, if this were Ruby, you could just say last. Sadly, it's parts.length -1. So however many there are, -1 gets you the last. Cool. So this is the public ID field of the house object, the return type of our mutation. So with the inputs declared, the return type declared, we've typed a lot, but it's time to actually declare the mutation itself. Now for this, we need a resolver. So we're going to export a class called the house resolver, and then we're just going to decorate this. So we need to say that it's a resolver, and then we'll go in and we'll declare the mutation that's going to live within this resolver. So it's going to be called create house, but it's asynchronous. Why is it asynchronous? Because it's going to actually write data to the database, and that happens asynchronously. So that's why we have to declare it as such. And we have our return. So what inputs or arguments is this going to receive? So this is a little bit weird how you declare them in type GraphQL, but you use decorators. So you say, I'm going to receive an arg. The arg I want is input. And now we're sort of more into JavaScript land. We're going to call this variable input. Now we're into TypeScript land, and it's going to be of type house input. So that's the whole thing. Decorator, variable name, TypeScript. So the next thing we want to receive is our context. That gives us the context variable, which is type authorized context. So how do we know it's authorized? Because we're going to come up here and we're going to decorate our mutation with authorized so that we only want it to be called if the user is authorized. So that ensures us we have a user ID to work with. And we also need to decorate it with a mutation. Now this mutation returns a house. So this up here that we declared, that's the return type. And we can give it an additional sort of value, nullable true. I forget what the default is as the response of the mutation, if it's nullable or not, but we're just going to be explicit, nullable true. When would it ever be null? I guess it's when you're calling this and you're not authorized. It's not going to return you house because it won't even try to create it. So with that done, it's time to actually call Prisma. So that's why we included the context here, because context gives us two things: the user ID, because we want to save that along with the house so we know who created it. And it also gives us Prisma, the Prisma client, so that we can insert it into the database. So we are going to return a promise. I guess you don't have to say await, but we can, just so that we're clear we're dealing with a promise. So we're accessing Prisma on the context, and we're going to access house and call create. So what do you pass to the create function? You pass some data, and then you basically pass all of the fields that exist in the database for this. So we've got our user ID, which is coming from context.uid. We have our image, which is coming from input.image. Address, is input.address. Latitude is input.coordinates.latitude. Longitude is very similar, input.coordinates.longitude. And then we just have the number of bedrooms, so input.bedrooms. Sweet. And all the red squigglies have gone away, meaning we've passed everything in the correct type. All the values are there. It's great. We're done. But we haven't connected our resolver yet to the actual GraphQL schema. So if you were to go and look in the browser here, it wouldn't show up here yet. So to get that to show up, we go into the index, we import the house resolver, and we add it to the end. Now I really like Type GraphQL's way of organizing these because you can have sort of little resolvers that each handle one portion. So images are handled here, houses here, users somewhere else, whatever, rentals somewhere else. And you can keep them really nicely compartmentalized. So with that in place, we can come back here, refresh, and we should see our schema has updated. So we have our new house type, our mutation, our inputs, all of that stuff. We even have docs, so we can go and we can click, here are the mutations, create house. Here's the inputs. It wants this with coordinates. So this is fantastic. GraphQL is sort of self-documenting in that way. And we're done the back-end part. So now it's time to move into the front end. And in the front end, what are we doing? Well, we're trying to call our mutation. And to do that, we need to first declare it. So why don't we hop over to the front end. So we'll go into components, house form, scroll up a little bit. So why don't we declare it just below the signature mutation? So we're going to call this the create house mutation. It's going to be a GraphQL query, but type mutation. So it's a mutation. We're going to call it the create house mutation. Now this one's a little bit different than this one above, which took no inputs. Remember, we have inputs here. So this is going to be passed in as a variable called input of type house input with a bang, meaning it's a required field. And then when we actually call the create house mutation, we're going to pass in to the input field the input variable. So variable is always denoted with the $sign here. What do we want back from this? We want just the ID of the house. So it's giving us a house. We could ask for all of the fields. I just want the ID. Why? So that we can redirect the user to the page that will show the details of this house. So that's our mutation. We're first now going to generate the types for this mutation. So we'll run the code gen command. So open up a clear console, run yard code gen, and it will generate some files. So we've got all the types for our create house mutation. See, it even knows we've only asked for the ID as a response, so you can never access the other fields. It's fantastic. Okay, so we're going to uncomment the import for this mutation. We're also going to uncomment the use router hook because we're going to use that to redirect the user to the right place once the mutation is finished. So with that in place, this file's getting massive now. It's complicated, it's doing a lot of stuff. But what we're going to do is go into the handle create function. Below where we got the image data is where we're going to call the mutation, but there's nothing to call yet. We forgot to go and create it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const create house is equal to the use mutation hook, which we'll pass some types to. But what's the actual mutation? It's the create house mutation. So the types that we imported here are these two. So I'm actually just going to copy them. And there's two this time, as opposed to last time there was only one. So what are the two types? Paste these in, let's save it. Cool. So in the angle brackets, we're basically declaring what's the return type, so that would be the house with the ID, and what is the type for the variables that it's expecting to receive. So we're giving it two types. So we've got our create house function to call this mutation. Back inside of handle create, we're going to call this. So what we're going to do is we're going to, we'll get a response for this, but we're going to await a call to create house. And we're going to pass some variables, the input variables. So what variables does it want? It wants one called input, but then it wants a whole bunch of data. So it's telling us right now, hey, you're missing all of the properties from the house input. So we need to just declare them. We're going to give the address. Where does this come from? It comes from the form data.address. We want the image. Where does this come from? So what we're talking about here, it's actually a string. So we just want that secure URL. So image data.secure URL. We want the coordinates. Now remember, we created a special type for this. So this is latitude of data.latitude and longitude, data.longitude. And we also want the bedrooms. But if we just said data.bedrooms, it would actually give us a type error because this is a string. This is a number or an int. So we're going to parse this string base 10. It's just an integer. So now the types are correct. So what does this give us back? It gives us data. We can't use the data variable. It's already been used. So we're going to call this house data. And what do we want to do with this house data? Well, first we're just going to check if it succeeded, if we got back the right response. So we're just going to say if house data dot create house like this. It's giving us an error because this is possibly null if it failed. So we're just going to put a question mark there to only call create house if this is non-null. So what do we want to do if create house succeeded? Well, we want to push the user, reroute them to the page that will show the details for that. So I wanted to call a variable called router. This doesn't exist yet. So we need to go up. You can put this at the beginning of the component and you can say const router is equal to use router, a hook from Next.js to get access to the router. Come down again and you can say router.push, and we're going to push the user to /houses and then the ID of the house. So we're just embed this in here, and that would be house data.create house.id. And it popped up because we typed everything correctly. Now, I'm not really handling errors well here. It's a good idea to do it. So you'd have to think about what's the best way to surface the errors to the user that came back from a mutation. It's not really too much they can do. If it gets to this point, you sort of messed up as a programmer because you should have done the validation prior to calling the mutation, which we did through the form. And so we should have valid data at this point. We've already ensured that they're authenticated, otherwise they wouldn't be on this page. So you could alert would be bad UI, but you might want to put some sort of toast or pops up like error, please try again. Up to you. We're just going to handle the happy path here. So we've done a lot of coding. We haven't tested anything. In a sense, that's the beauty of TypeScript, because if there were like an error with our types, it would show me some red. It would give me some TypeScript errors. So why don't we come back here, try this out. If it works, we should be redirected over to the houses page. So where should we go? Why don't we go into Orangeville, Ontario? So 50 Broadway, Orangeville. This is around where I grew up. So we'll pick Orangeville. We'll pick the donkey. Number of bedrooms. There we go. Submit that. So it does take a while, but it worked eventually. So see, we're at houses/1. So that means everything we've built has worked so far. We've created the signature to upload to Cloudinary. We've uploaded the image to Cloudinary. and then we've called our mutation to save the house into the database. It gave us back ID 1. I don't have it open. If we wanted to go into table plus the database tool, open up the database, go to the houses table, here's our info. So we have ID 1, the user ID, the image path, the whole secure URL, the latitude, longitude, everything's here. It all saved correctly. We're on the houses 1 page. That's what the next video is about. It's about how do we query the data for this house and show it to the user. That was it. Long one. Thanks for sticking with me. See ya.